Welcome to Focus on Abilities, a program about issues affecting the lives of people with disabilities. My name is Lex Frieden. I'll be your host for today's program. I'm Senior Vice President at TIRR Memorial Hermann Hospital and also Professor of Disability Informatics at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. We have a great guest today to discuss some very important and interesting subjects. But before I introduce her, I want to ask you a question that we will answer before the end of today's program. So the question is this: what personal psychosocial characteristics, what are the kinds of emotional standards that one must have in order to successfully adapt to trauma, to problems that one encounters in one's life, to disability, to disaster, and to other kinds of issues like that? We'll discuss this subject and we'll answer the question before the end of today's program. Now, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our guest, and that is Dr. Roberta Diddel. Roberta, welcome to Focus on Abilities.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you are the executive director and the founder of a program called Psychology Works.
Yes.
And that has an interesting sounding title, but what in fact is it?
Psychology Works is a nonprofit organization, and we create educational opportunities, what we call the therapeutic classroom, for individuals with medical disabilities, chronic disease, to learn about how to adapt. When you get a diagnosis of a chronic disease, when you have an injury like a stroke or a spinal cord injury that leaves you disabled, the doctors take care of your physical needs and they teach you how to deal with the medical problems. But who tells you how to live with it? Who helps you to manage and cope with what is a major life-changing event? Nobody is the answer. And organizations like the MS Society, the Alzheimer's Association do a lot of good work. They provide a lot of research dollars to look for cures. They do medical informational programming, but fewer than 1 in 6 of those organizations offer any kind of information about how to cope.
Now, Roberta, when you described Psychology Works, one of the first descriptors you used was therapeutic classroom. And to me, that sounds a little bit like a sterile environment, if you will. I know that's not what you've created, because I know a little bit about your background, and I wonder if we could share with our audience what really got you interested in this whole subject matter. I mean, you had a personal experience with disability.
Yes, I did. 35 years ago, when I was 22, oh my God, that tells you how old I am. I was injured in a car accident and had a spinal cord injury that left me quadriplegic. And I sort of seemed at the time to buck the odds in that I kind of recovered from it very quickly. I'm what they call now a resilient responder. They're discovering now that that's a more common phenomenon than people used to think. But what I realized is that some people are resilient. I looked around me in the rehabilitation center where I was and recognized that some people are really laid low by those kinds of experiences, and other people seem to do better. So that fascinated me, and when I went back to college and through graduate school to get my Ph.D., I was always focused on what makes people able to do better. At the time, psychology focused on identifying psychopathology and what happens when things go wrong. Now we're looking more at what we call positive psychology, which is what makes certain people able to do better when they undergo some traumatic event.
Roberta, you've described your recovery as a good recovery, and I think that's interesting. It actually goes directly to the point of what you're trying to achieve with your program, I think. Good recovery to many people who look at a person with a spinal cord injury would say, oh, gosh, she got over it, she's walking again, she's able to continue her daily activities just as she did before this trauma, before this catastrophe, before this accident. But you yourself described your recovery as a good recovery. Now, I'm inclined to believe, like me, you just got a sense of yourself as a person who had certain restrictions in your life, but as far as your mental outlook towards life, you were back on track rather quickly.
That's true. In fact, I was back taking classes on leave from the hospital before I was even discharged from rehabilitation. So I think that a good recovery for someone who is going to have continuing physical limitation means that you minimize what's limiting. A disability is a physical limitation. A handicap is the social or emotional impact that that disability has. So our programs attempt to limit the handicapping characteristics of disabilities. You may have to live with disabling aspects of a chronic disease like MS or like recurrent cancer or a spinal cord injury or a stroke, but the question is, how handicapped do you have to be?
And you really, through your own personal experience again, but now more through your research, it seems to me, have identified some characteristics that enable people to adapt more quickly, to, quote, recover more quickly. Some of those characteristics, I guess, we're wired with, and others can be learned, or how does that work?
Yeah, I think it's both. We can be wired to be more positive. Some of us are just born more like Pooh, you know, hey, this is a beautiful day, and other people are more like Eeyore. No matter how great a day it is, Eeyore says, oh, I don't know, it's kind of sunny. And some people just come out a little bit more pessimistic, a little less open to experience. It's more difficult for them to recover from any kind of trauma just because they have a tendency to react to things in a more negative way and have a more difficult time making a transition.
Do you think that's purely genetic, or is that behaviors and characteristics we acquire near our birth or from our parents, or what actually leads people to have those kind of built-in response adaptations?
Well, research would suggest that it's about 50-50, that it does make a difference if your parents were negative and more like Eeyore, or more positive and more open to experience. But things like early childhood trauma, abuse, parental alcoholism, parental illness, anything that would compromise your ability to cope well.
Some of us, I mean, people can't really control, and particularly children can't control whether their parents have a good or bad attitude, whether their parents are alcoholic or not. I mean, is it possible if somebody gets sort of framed in that circumstance for them to change their outlook? Is it possible for them to become more adaptive, to move from the Eeyore to the Pooh side of the equation?
Absolutely, and I think that the first step is recognizing that this may be a limiting factor for you. If you have had a history of trauma, if you haven't coped well with other things, it may be holding you back. It may be creating a greater likelihood that you'll be anxious or depressed if you have a chronic disease or a disabling condition. And so recognizing that you have those limitations and then beginning to look for ways to challenge that. It colors your belief system. One of the things that we've learned from research is that people who have what's called a hardiness factor, a belief that they can have some sort of positive impact on life, tend to do much better. And you may not have been raised with or born with a tendency to be hardy, but I think you can take on that attitude.
You can actually make a conscious commitment
Yes.
to acquire certain characteristics that will prepare you for or enable you to respond more constructively to catastrophe in your life. Is that correct?
Yes, I think you can adapt to those kinds of ways of thinking, adopting a new attitude toward life. And again, being aware when you begin to drift off into your negative ways of thinking, pulling yourself back, challenging that way of thinking, and helping the people around you to understand that they need to bring you back to that more positive way of thinking.
Well, and we're not saying, I guess, that that everybody should just wake up in the morning and say it's a great day when it's raining and it's not a great day. That's not the point. The point is that people should be able to understand and analyze their circumstances and cope with it in a way that will enable them to have a good outcome, the one that they really want.
Yes, and there's a general understanding in the community that it's important when something bad happens to talk about it endlessly, and psychotherapists unfortunately propagate that idea that it's better to talk about it, and thinking about feeling bad is going to, and talking about feeling bad is going to make you feel better. Research does not support that.
Well, that's interesting.
It is. Research really supports that the people who cope the best are the ones who are able to put aside those negative feelings, not ignore them when they need to be addressed, like ignoring that you have a physical problem and so you're not doing things to adapt, but really being able to put it on the back burner and focus on things that are more positive. Not think about how bad you feel or the pain that you experience, but focusing on going to school, going to work.
In other words, not necessarily repress it and gunny sack it, but just to set it aside, to put it on another track while you go past it with some things that are on a faster track or more important track to you.
Yeah, to enable yourself to do so that you can function. And when you function, you become whatever you're doing. So if you're doing positive things, then you begin to become that more positive force in the world.
We want to talk about how psychology actually works, and how people in our community can have access to some of the knowledge that you have and that you share. We're going to take a break now from Focus, and when we come back, I'd like for you to tell a story that will help our audience perhaps understand better some of the issues that affect people responding to catastrophe and to trauma. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back after this break from Focus on Abilities. Welcome back to Focus on Abilities. I'm Lex Frieden, your host, and we're here today with the founder and executive director of Psychology Works, Dr. Roberta Diddel. Before the break, I asked Roberta if she would tell us a story, but before I ask her to give you the story, I have to clarify one thing. Roberta, you said that people sometimes can adapt better and deal with issues that affect them if they're not necessarily talking about it. That some of the old theories we used to hear from psychotherapists about you got to bring it out, you got to deal with it, and so on and so forth, don't necessarily hold true. That people can deal with issues in other ways too, that they can actually contain them and go past them with other issues of their lives. It is okay to talk about things that bother you, though, if you're that kind of person that needs to do it, right?
It is, absolutely. And it's certainly important to talk about things when you don't really understand how you feel, because it seems as though talking, expressing feelings verbally helps us to identify what we're feeling. There is a point at which you have to be willing to let go of those feelings, though, because it can be overwhelming. And for the people who don't cope well, they seem to get stuck in those feelings.
Interesting.
And so it's not that you shouldn't talk about it, it's that you shouldn't be so focused on how you feel and so overwhelmed by how you feel that you can't function.
So if you're the type of person, as I am, that likes to talk, you talk through it. If you get stuck in it, then you really need to try another approach.
Exactly, and it may be just, you may not feel it or experience it as much as the people around you do. So take cues from people around you. If they seem to be tuning you out or telling you, to get off of it, maybe they're right, And again, if it's constructive denial, I call, then it means that you are putting it aside. It's not that you're not allowing yourself to feel or to talk about it, but that you're able to put aside for long periods of time so that you can function and so that you can do purposeful, meaningful activities.
Yeah, I mean, as human beings, we're fortunately able to do more than one thing at a time. And our brains do many more things than one at a time. And if we're able to park an issue that we're concerned about for a while and do some other things that really are fun to do, interesting to do, important to do, that's a good thing, a good way to cope. Is that right?
It's not only a good way to cope, but it also is a good way to develop the new identity that you begin to develop if you have a permanent disabling condition. Because it does change who you are to some degree. You're essentially yourself, but you are also who you are what you do. And so what you do will determine the kind of person that you become. I am a psychologist. That's a part of my identity. It's because that's what I do. And it has nothing to do with being disabled. So the ability to develop an identity that's strong and purposeful and meaningful that's outside of your disability, I think is important.
Okay. Now, you have a story that I'd like for you to share with our audience that helps to illustrate some of the issues we're talking about. Would you please?
I would be happy to. When I was going through rehabilitation, I caught a cold, and because my system was compromised at the time, the cold quickly turned into pneumonia. I ended up in an intensive care unit on a respirator. They used a tracheostomy, which meant that it bypasses your voice box, so I was unable to speak. And you don't know me very well, but I like to talk, and that was very upsetting, more upsetting even than being very sick. The doctors told my husband that I might not survive, and if I did survive, I might not ever get off the respirator. So for me, it was just being in this dark room where it was never day and it was never nighttime, and there weren't a lot of visitors, and I was incredibly bored. So I noticed that the respirator, the machine that I was hooked up to, had a little light on it that sometimes it would come on and sometimes it would go off, and it would come on and go off. And there wasn't any particular rhythm to it. I couldn't figure out what made it come on. It was just this little green light that would occasionally come on and go off. So finally I got curious, and I asked the nurse what that little light did. And she explained to me that the light was an indicator of whether the machine was breathing for me or whether I was initiating the breath myself. So the light would go on when I was breathing for myself, and it would be off when the machine was breathing for me. So I thought, good, something to do. And I began trying to make the light go on. Now, about 2 weeks later, I was off the respirator, and another week after that, I was back in rehab, and the rest is history. We know a lot more now than we did then about a phenomenon called biofeedback, which is where machines give you information about what your body is doing. And I think what I might have created for myself was a little biofeedback machine that possibly enabled me to begin to breathe for myself more effectively, and maybe enabled me to get off the respirator and survive. I don't know that that is what happened, and I certainly didn't do it for the purpose of being more healthy. But what I learned from that experience is you never really know what it is that might make things better. And so my theory is do what you can. Whatever is in front of you, if it looks like a positive thing, do it. Turn on the green light. What's a green light for me may not be the same as what's a green light for you, but wherever those green lights are in our lives, that's what we should identify and try to make happen. And that is basically Psychology Works' philosophy, is find those green lights and help people identify what those green lights are and teach them some ways of turning on the green lights in their life.
Roberta, now Psychology Works is a program. It's an active program. You offer training programs how often? Once a month?
We have monthly programs called Second Saturdays because, surprise, surprise, it's the second Saturday of every month. And each month we have a different topic. We may be focusing on how to manage with your relationships when you have a disability. We have a program that involves how you can be a good consumer in a hostile environment, as I think medical care is these days. So it's each month it's a program that will help you cope with the things that are challenging about having a disability and living with a disability.
Okay, it's the second Saturday, and where is it?
It takes place at the United Way, which is 50 Waugh Drive, and you can go to our website and find out what the program is for each month, and it will give you a map to the United Way as well.
The website is www.psychologyworks.com, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, I think we'll have a view of that on the screen. And Roberta, is there a phone number that people should call if they want further information?
They can call 713-660-8878.
Okay, that's second Saturday. You're also doing some things with some of the various hospitals and clinics in town?
Yes, because we really believe that not only should we educate individuals who have disabilities, but we also should educate people who are working with those people, because often they don't have an appreciation for what the emotional and social impact is of living with a chronic disease or disability. So we go into various organizations, the Harris County Hospital District, TIER, and organizations like the Multiple Sclerosis Society, to educate their staff and also to train their volunteers who run their support groups. We give continuing education programs for mental health professionals so that they understand the difference between working with people who are coming in with, I say, ordinary problems like marital discord. How is it different to be working with somebody who is living with a chronic disease or a disability?
So it's really designed, some of those programs are designed to help healthcare professionals and those who are working with people who have disabilities to reinforce constructive, adaptive mechanisms for the people and to help them understand what some of the issues that people are dealing with under these circumstances are. Roberta, let's review before we end the program today what some of the principal adaptive mechanisms that people either have that make them more resilient in these circumstances or that they may acquire by their own self-analysis or with assistance of others. What are those things? What are those characteristics?
Well, first of all, attitude does matter. It makes a big difference, and it may be that you are going against your normal tendency to be negative, but being positive, believing that you have an impact on your health, gives you that hardiness factor that will allow you to do better, because if you believe that you can make a difference in your health, then you'll look for ways to do that, and it will happen. So that's one of the aspects. Another aspect is being able to get away from the disturbing realities of living with a disability. It's not fun, and there are a lot of things that can distract you and embarrass you and make it hard for you to get out there and be a part of society again. Being able to put those aside and turn them off and just do what you need to do to live a full life is another important factor. And doing becomes being. If you, after a while, are doing things that feel good, that you enjoy, that are meaningful for you, then that will increase your ability to enjoy life and make the most of life with a disability.
So in general, what we're saying is that people, any one of us at any time, can be subject to a disability. We can have a car accident that will cause us to be disabled. We can have an illness or another kind of injury that will cause us to be disabled. Some people are born with disabilities. Others are affected by disasters, catastrophes, and so on. We can all do better to adapt to those disabilities, that we can recover without necessarily having full physical or functional recovery, but mentally we can recover, psychologically we can recover, and we can go about our lives being constructive people thinking the good thoughts and living the good life. Is that correct?
That is correct. And if you are not living the good life, if you're not enjoying yourself, if you feel as though you're depressed or extremely anxious, or you see a family member who is, then that is reason to go and get help.
Okay. Roberta Diddel, thank you very much for being our guest today on Focus on Abilities. I think this has been a very informative show. I want to thank all of you for watching Focus on Abilities. I want to thank HTV for producing it for us. And my name is Lex Frieden. I hope you'll join us next time for more Focus on Abilities.